When we talk about imitation, we tend to think that the idea itself should have a physical form. But in reality, the idea doesn't have a physical form. There are all kinds of different hammers out there, but what makes them hammers is the idea of what a hammer is. Does the hammer itself have a physical form? No, it doesn't. This is what we call the shared essence without form. Plato's theory of ideas really explains a lot about human civilization. Take the example of a hammer. We call something a hammer because it looks like what we think a hammer should be. But every imitation has its flaws, which we call imperfect imitation. So, how do we find these flaws? How do we figure out what's wrong with real things? In Chinese thinking, we also find flaws. What are they? Well, in our everyday experiences, we realize that something doesn't quite meet our needs or doesn't feel right, and that's when we spot the flaws. In the West, when they say something has flaws, it means it doesn't match the idea in our heads. I have this idea of what a hammer should be, and when I see hammers made by Danes or Chinese, they're close to what I'm thinking but not exactly the same, and that's the flaw. And when there are flaws, things need to be changed to make them better match what? The idea. From Plato's theory of ideas, what's for sure? The notion of changing the world. So, once this theory is set, folks in the West believe in an ideal world, because everyone can grasp the idea. Hence, this ideal world is something we can achieve, obviously, through the mind. Then, when we size up reality, we're bound to spot flaws, and when there are flaws, they gotta be fixed. The natural world needs fixing, and so does human society. Chinese folks never had the notion of changing the world because they don't have the theory of ideas. They don't split the world into two parts, one being the world made up of tangible things called reality, and the other being the world of ideal things that we all get in our heads. There's no division of the two worlds. When you split the world into two, truth is all about the ideas. When you compare it to real life, you see all the flaws, and once you spot them, you gotta change them. That's the idea theory by Plato, and it's had a huge impact on European civilization right up to now. It's all about changing the world, first by changing nature, and then by changing society. So, what have we humans come up with in the end? Stuff that doesn't even exist in nature. In the Chinese belief of harmony between humans and nature, it's just not possible for Chinese civilization to create things that aren't natural. You take a raw piece of stone and shape it into something real, it's not like it's not from nature, it's just changing its form, it still belongs to nature. But what have we come up with today? Let's take a simple example, like bubble gum. When you chew bubble gum, you gotta know that after you've chewed out all the sweetness, you can't swallow it because your body can't break it down, it's not something that naturally exists. Another example is found during the big economic crisis in the 1930s. The United States got caught up in it, and Americans can't live without cream, but at that time, the natural supply of cream was running low. What to do? Chemists stepped in and made artificial cream, called vegetable essence oil, and it tastes really good. But this stuff is actually not edible because it can't go through the natural cycle. Once it's in your body, it can't be broken down. If you eat a certain amount of artificial vegetable oil every day, your liver will take a hit. So, Denmark has this interesting law that says no food with artificial vegetable oil is allowed in the whole country. I'm having coffee now, and it has a bit in it. You can't get Nestle's instant 3-in-1 coffee in Denmark, it's not allowed. If it weren't for Plato's ideas, Western science wouldn't have come this far, making stuff that doesn't fit into nature's plan. Only the West can pull this off, like using nuclear power and dropping atomic bombs. And then there's the whole deal with creating massive energy through artificial nuclear reactions. Why do we do that? What did Einstein discover? Well, he came up with E equals mc squared, which is like the mass-energy equivalence formula. And you know what? This theory actually led to the invention of the atomic bomb. So, we're not just using nuclear energy to make weapons, but we're also setting up nuclear power plants. But let's be real, this is some serious stuff we're dealing with. If a nuclear power plant goes haywire, the consequences are gonna be off the charts and totally out of control. Just look at the Fukushima nuclear crisis, that was a mess. I mean, Japan had over 50 nuclear power plants, and that's just asking for trouble, especially when you consider natural disasters like tsunamis. And then there's this whole idea that, thanks to science and technology, we can use nuclear energy absolutely safely. Can you really buy into that? Nah, you can't. Because if you do, you're basically turning your back on philosophy and religion. Because let's face it, both philosophy and religion tell us that humans are bound to mess up. Am I right? This is like a philosophical or religious idea, and religion really lays it on thick, saying that humans are sinful and that's why we can't mess with nuclear energy, not even for peaceful stuff. Once we mess up, there's no going back. So, where does all this come from? It's all about the way we think, it's from the theory of ideas. Chinese folks don't have big dreams of changing the world, as they lack strong ideologies. In contrast, people in the West are all about changing the world with their big ideas and philosophies. They've already done a lot to transform nature, but when it comes to reshaping human society, the only blueprint out there is in a book called The Republic by Plato, where he writes about an ideal human society. China's history is pretty cool. Instead of transforming the social structure, it's more like one dynasty just replaces another in a never-ending cycle of order and chaos. Has the social structure changed? Nope, not really. Xian Mu, died 1990, got into studying Chinese history and intellectual history all because of something that happened back in high school. It was a rainy day, so the PE class got cancelled. But instead of letting the time go to waste, the teacher decided to hold the class and started off with, "I've been thinking about something, and I want to share it with you. I'm really into history." Turns out, this PE teacher was a big history buff. He'd studied both Western history and the history of China, and after comparing the two, he noticed a pattern. Both the West and China had their fair share of wars, but in China, it seemed like a never-ending cycle of order and chaos. Take Zhu Yuanzhang, for example. He came from a poor peasant background and ended up becoming an emperor. But did that change the system? Nope, not really. He was just another emperor. On the other hand, in the West, after a bunch of big revolutions and wars, the social structure actually moved forward. Feudalism replaced slavery, and then capitalism took over from feudalism. It was all about progress. So, the PE teacher threw out this big question: why did this happen? The difference between Chinese history and Western history is huge. He was talking about it, and someone was listening below. From that moment, he made a promise to study and solve this problem for the rest of his life. That person turned out to be the Qian Mu we later got to know. It was all because of the inspiration from his physical education teacher that he decided to delve into Chinese history. Later on, he realized that in order to answer this question, one must also study the history of Chinese thought. Why does Romance of the Three Kingdoms start with the statement that major events in the world go through cycles of long periods of division followed by long periods of unity? This suggests that Chinese politics didn't progress but instead followed a repetitive pattern. Now we understand that the Chinese people are actually compelled to change the social structure because of the Western influence, as the Chinese lacked a guiding ideology. Previously, the Chinese didn't have the desire to transform society. The Chinese version of the word revolution is pretty interesting. It's been around for ages, as in the Tang Wu Revolution, 11th century BCE. But when we use the Chinese version to translate the English word revolution, we're actually getting it wrong. Revolution means overthrowing, it means a complete change. But in China, it's not quite the same. Here, revolution refers to the transfer of the mandate of heaven. It's when an emperor starts to mess things up, and the heavens decide to ditch him. The mandate of heaven shifts, and a true heir to the throne is on the way. This news is spread through children's rhymes, probably written by scholars and taught to kids, hinting that a new emperor is coming. So, for the Chinese, revolution is all about the mandate of heaven changing hands, not about changing society. This shows a crucial difference. It makes you wonder why Chinese history and European history took different paths, right? Well, to understand that, we've got to look at where their ideas came from. And we've found that Plato's theory of ideas plays a big part in it. After Western culture came to China, following the May 4th New Culture movement, Chinese folks started thinking in two ways. First, they believed that history isn't just a repeating cycle, but a journey of progress, known as the view of historical progress. Then there's the idea of transforming society, which is actually borrowed from the West and not originally Chinese. Everybody knows Dong Zhongshu's, 2nd century BCE, famous saying, "Heaven does not change, and its way does not change." Is history a journey of progress? No, it's not. That's why Yan Fu's, died 1921, translation of Evolution and Ethics is so important. Huxley's Evolution and Ethics actually talks about the theory of biological evolution, and Yan Fu translated it to imply that human society's history is also an evolutionary and progressive process. This is the first time in the history of Chinese thought that the idea of historical progress has been set forth. Are we Chinese folks today all caught up in this kind of thinking? And what does it really mean that we're a bit more advanced now than before? What's the deal with improving this mindset a bit? We're starting to see that every step forward comes with a step back in some other way. It's like we're finally waking up to this, and we're not just blindly cheering on progress. When we think about it, we're kind of circling back to an old school wisdom, like what Heraclitus said. We talked about that ancient Greek philosopher earlier, and his words really hit home. He said, "You can't step into the same river twice, and also, the way up and the way down are one and the same." Those sayings are really deep, and they're just one part of ancient Greek wisdom. So, progress is like moving up, but at the same time, it's also like moving down. It's like the same road leads both ways. So, in simple terms for today, what comes with every bit of progress? A bit of regression. That's some ancient wisdom right there. We do not discuss all that stuff here. We go back to the Platonic idea of philosophy. They split things into two worlds, so where's the truth? The truth is in the world of ideas on the other side. When this idealistic thinking mixes with Jewish thought, bam, you get Christianity, because heaven is that otherworldly place, and that's where the truth lies. So, when Platonic philosophy and Jewish thought got together, Christianity was born, and then Western history went into this super long period called the Middle Ages, which lasted for over 1,000 years. So, now we're moving on to the third part of the lecture. According to my plan, we should delve into Stoicism in late ancient Greece. This school of thought is really significant because during the late period of ancient Greece, Western and Greek philosophy started to ponder the meaning of individual life. This shift occurred because the peak of Greek philosophy, which was during the teachings of Plato and Aristotle, had passed. That was the golden age of Greek philosophy. After that, it started to decline, and in the late period of ancient Greece, Greek society began to fall apart. The breakdown of traditions and culture put everyone at risk. In this situation, ancient Greek thinking started to really dig into the whole "what's the point of life" thing, and that led to three big schools of thought. One of them is called what? Epicureanism, one is called Stoicism, and the third one is called skepticism. All three of these major groups were all about figuring out the meaning of life for each individual person. Back then, Greek thinking was summed up like this: the sun had gone down, and folks had to mull over philosophical stuff on their own. It was like the end of an era of idealism, and now we all have to figure out the truth for ourselves. Kind of feels like we're in the same boat today, having to ponder philosophical questions in our own light. That got me thinking about Confucianism, Zen Buddhism, and Taoism, and it hit me that our post-90s generation can be split into three groups: Confucian, Taoist, and Buddhist, all of which have to ponder the meaning of life. It's kind of like the situation I just mentioned. Out of these, the main focus should be on Stoicism. Epicureanism is pretty straightforward, known as the philosophy of happiness. What is happiness? Well, he said that life is all about being happy, we live for joy. Do we agree with that? Yeah, we live for joy, that's for sure. But what is happiness? Epicurus came up with two things: the tranquility of the soul and the absence of bodily pain. It's really simple, it's called the Epicurean philosophy of life. If our young generation agrees with this, things will be pretty straightforward. Don't overthink it, because if you do, your soul will be all over the place. We should be happy that we're not sick, because our bodies are pain-free. What more could you ask for? So, this is Epicureanism, but people have totally misunderstood it. They've gone and labeled it as hedonism, which totally twists what Epicurus was all about. His philosophy of life is actually pretty straightforward. It's all about balancing the needs of the soul and the body.